In this video, I wanted to take a look at one of the major propagandists of the modern American right, Dinesh D'Souza. His attempt to shift the burden of fascism onto modern-day Democrats and leftists is so shameless that his short video for PragerU could almost be mistaken for comedy. Honestly, it looks like the hypnosis scene straight out of Zoolander. But besides this unintended hilarity, and besides aging myself with that reference, his video is no joke. And this attempt to expose fascism as a left-wing ideology more generally is telling for two reasons. Firstly, it signals that right-wing apologists seem to concede the fact that, when taken to its extreme, right-wing ideology is so repugnant and indefensible that even the excesses of the far left are still relatively morally superior. Secondly, in terms of policy, however, Dinesh and his colleagues are outraged. Not at the unbridled xenophobia and ultranationalism of fascist regimes that directly led to the worst genocide in human history, but they are inexplicably outraged at these regimes' implementation and expansion of social programs in order to haphazardly drive their point forward. But do we hate fascist regimes for their social programs? Or do we hate them for their genocidal war against Jews and other minority groups? The answer is pretty self-evident, I would hope, but it seems like Dinesh and company are unaware of why we find fascism reprehensible in the first place, which is troubling to say the least. Having said all that, let's take a look at Dinesh's awful video entitled, "Is Fascism Right or Left?"
He's a fascist. For decades, this has been a favorite smear of the left aimed at those on the right. Every Republican president, for that matter, virtually every Republican, since the 1970s has been called a fascist, now more than ever. This label is based on the idea that fascism is a phenomenon of the political right. The left says it is, and some self-styled white supremacists and neo-Nazis embrace the label.
We start off the video with a really bizarre claim. Some embrace this term. The term fascist, used in a contemporary context, is a pejorative term. It's an insult. I'm not aware of anyone embracing this term. What Dinesh actually means to say here is, KKK and neo-Nazi groups embrace the term right. They see themselves as the right opposing the left. But in Dinesh's world, the term fascist doesn't apply to these people. So, who is a fascist according to D'Souza? Well, we'll find out here in just a minute. But for his absurd argument to even work, Dinesh attempts to disassociate historical fascism from the political right. But how does he do this? Well, it's simple.
We know the name of the philosopher of capitalism, Adam Smith. We know the name of the philosopher of Marxism, Karl Marx. But who's the philosopher of fascism?
Giovanni Gentile. Oh shit, was I not supposed to get that answer? I'm sorry, Dinesh. I hope this doesn't affect your argument. Please, continue.
Yes, exactly. You don't know. Don't feel bad. Almost no one knows. This is not because he doesn't exist, but because historians, most of whom are on the political left, had to erase him from history in order to avoid confronting fascism's actual beliefs.
And that's how he makes it work. For his claim to hold, Dinesh begins by setting up his argument with a conspiracy theory. Dinesh claims that leftist historians have erased Gentile from history, which just isn't true. He relies on his audience not knowing who Gentile is, but I hope it goes without saying that even if someone didn't know the answer to Dinesh's stupid fucking question, that doesn't prove anything. Now, while I do agree that most historians are left-wing, I do agree that most educated people are left-wing, there's still no evidence to support his claim. Now, I want to ask a question. What's more reasonable? Fascism is a rightfully discredited and forgotten political ideology. Or there has been a concerted and organized effort by leftist historians to completely cover up history. There is this one group that was really fond of Marxist conspiracy theories too. The name escapes me right now, but I'm sure they'll come up later.
So let me introduce him to you. His name is Giovanni Gentile. Born in 1875, he was one of the world's most influential philosophers in the first half of the 20th century. Like his philosophical mentor Karl Marx, Gentile wanted to create a community that resembles the family, a community where we are all in this together. It's easy to see the attraction of this idea. Indeed, it remains a common rhetorical theme of the left. For example, at the 1984 convention of the Democratic Party, the governor of New York, Mario Cuomo, likened America to an extended family, where, through the government, people all take care of each other. Nothing's changed. 30 years later, a slogan of the 2012 Democratic Party convention was, "The government is the only thing we all belong to." They might as well have been quoting Gentile.
That's right, guys. To Dinesh, the Democrats are actually the real fascists you see. It's not people like Richard Spencer or David Duke who are deserving of the term fascist. No, it's people like fucking Mario Cuomo. I mentioned this in my intro, but it seems like Dinesh is missing the point entirely. If you are outraged at white supremacists' white supremacy and are instead still outraged at Democrats, like Mario Cuomo, then there's a serious problem.
Now remember, Gentile was a man of the left. He was a committed socialist. For Gentile, fascism is a form of socialism, indeed, its most workable form. While the socialism of Marx mobilizes people on the basis of class, fascism mobilizes people by appealing to their national identity as well as their class. Fascists are socialists with a national identity. German fascists in the 1930s were called Nazis, basically a contraction of the term National Socialist.
Oh hey, Nazis. I knew they'd come up. Also, minor point, but Nazi is not a contraction of National Socialist, like say the word don't is a contraction of the words do and not. Nazi is a contraction of the German word national, or national. It's almost as if Nazis were nationalists first and foremost.
For Gentile, all private action should be oriented to serve society. There's no distinction between the private interest and the public interest. Correctly understood, the two are identical. And who is the administrative arm of society? It's none other than the state. Consequently, to submit to society is to submit to the state, not just in economic matters, but in all matters. Since everything is political, the state gets to tell everyone how to think and what to do. It was another Italian, Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy from 1922 to 1943, who turned Gentile's words into action. In his Dottrina del Fascismo, one of the doctrinal statements of early fascism, Mussolini wrote, "All is in the state, and nothing human exists or has value outside the state." He was merely paraphrasing Gentile.
Fucking finally, Dinesh mentions an actual source, The Doctrine of Fascism by Benito Mussolini, and he reads the quote we just heard. Although the quote itself isn't cited, I think I found the excerpt that Dinesh is referencing. And although the work is credited to Mussolini, Gentile ghost wrote part of it and was the primary philosophical inspiration behind the entire work. And would you believe it, I can still access the doctrine on PDF. So much for those left-wing historians. Gentile says, fascism reasserts the rights of the state as expressing the real essence of the individual. And if liberty is to the attribute of living men and not of abstract dummies invented by individualistic liberalism, then fascism stands for liberty, and for the only liberty worth having. The liberty of the state and of the individual within the state. The fascist conception of the state is all Really? The fascist conception of the state is all embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value. Thus understood, fascism is totalitarian, and the fascist state, a synthesis and unit inclusive of all values, interprets, develops, and potentates the whole life of a people. Oh wait, there's more. No individuals or groups outside the state. Fascism is therefore opposed to socialism, to which unity within the state is unknown, and which sees in history nothing but the class struggle. Well, that's weird. He pretty much just condemned the entirety of socialism. Not a specific variance of socialism, but like all of socialism. How is Gentile a socialist? In what way is fascism a form of socialism? Why did Dinesh leave this part out? I mean, who's covering up history? The only excerpt from the Doctrine of Fascism that Dinesh actually cites is all is within the state and nothing exists outside of the state. Dinesh again relies on his audience to equate any and all government intervention with socialism. In the broadest sense, socialism is the socialization of the means of production, pretty much any place that produces goods or services for a society. How will that be achieved? Well, that's up for debate because the role of the state is actually quite a contentious issue within the socialist movement. But it does not necessarily mean a dictatorial state, and it does not mean that all state intervention is socialism. Of course, are there specific variants of socialism that favor a dictatorial government? Sure. But if Dinesh is here to criticize that, then he'll find many leftists who condemn such practices. However, that isn't what Dinesh is saying here, is it? To him and many like him, state intervention is socialism and vice versa, but that simply isn't true. For fascists like Gentile and Mussolini, the state ultimately existed as a means unto itself. It intervened in society in order to ensure its own existence and for no other reason. This is not socialism, even in the most generous meaning of the term. To fascists, nothing could exist independently of the state or after the state, and the state was the ultimate and final manifestation of human development. For a country like, say, the USSR, on the other hand, which was, undeniably during Stalin at least, a totalitarian nightmare, its mandated goal was achieving a fully classless, moneyless, and stateless society. Now, this is up for debate, but the point I'm trying to make is fascism, as a theory, is diametrically opposed to the idea of a stateless society, and opposed to practically all variants of socialism, all of which have a pragmatic outlook of the state at best. And Gentile agrees with me. You see, first and foremost, fascists were nationalists. Dinesh says fascists are socialists with a national identity when in truth they were simply nationalists with a heavy social program. Now, while the fascist social program was a very real component of the ideology, it was seen as a pragmatic tool. It was not the end, but only the means in their ultimate goal of preserving a nation. Remember the above quote when Gentile rejected socialism outright? He goes on to say, fascism is likewise opposed to trade unionism as a class weapon, but when brought within the orbit of the state, fascism recognizes the real needs which gave rise to socialism and trade unionism, giving them due weight in the guild or corporative system in which divergent interests are coordinated and harmonized in the unity of the state. Moving on.
Leftists can't acknowledge their man Gentile because that would undermine their attempt to bind conservatism to fascism. Conservatism wants small government so that individual liberty can flourish. The left, like Gentile, wants the opposite, to place the resources of the individual and industry in the service of a centralized state. To acknowledge Gentile is to acknowledge that fascism bears a deep kinship to the ideology of today's left.
Dinesh says the left can't recognize Gentile because that would undermine their attempt to bind conservatism to fascism. And then he goes on to apply a laughably generous and inadequate definition for conservatism. Notice here too that Dinesh is backing off from the initial claim, fascism is right-wing, to fascism is conservative, particularly conservative in the American neoliberal sense. But if Dinesh's argument were simply, hey, we're conservatives, we're not fascists, then he'd be right. But the burden is on him to explain why fascism is not a right-wing phenomenon, and why it has nothing to do with the right, but he fails. Quite miserably, might I add. Conservatism, especially Dinesh's gracious definition, does not encapsulate all of what is considered right-wing thought. And even the term conservatism itself varies from country to country and from time to time. It all depends on what exactly is being conserved, and those are values that simply change over time. In the case of fascism in Italy in the early 20th century, Dinesh is right, to an extent. Fascism didn't see itself as a reactionary, but as a revolutionary force. However, Dinesh fails to mention that Italian fascists were, nevertheless, deeply socially conservative despite their revolutionary rhetoric. They supported traditional gender roles and marriage, for example, and opposed things like abortion rights and homosexuality, which actually does have a lot in common with American conservatism, particularly neoconservatism. But that would be the wrong way to drive my argument. I mean, if I really wanted to be a dick, I could point out how, the USSR under Stalin was, incredibly socially conservative as well. and that they banned things like homosexuality and abortion. And I guess since they were conservative, that makes them right wing too. And then I could point to some superficial things like how the USSR actually stood for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and try to draw a correlation with like the Republican Party. But I'd have to be a real fucking idiot for that to be my argument. The right way to do this is by pointing out that Dinesh has, in effect, recreated the left-right political spectrum by reducing it to a government-no government dichotomy, where the former is a stand-in for leftism and the latter a stand-in for rightism. Not only does this sanitize the right, but it also shifts every authoritarian regime in history, from Ba'athist Iraq to Francoist Spain, onto the left. And that's ridiculous because it ignores the anti-government tendencies within the left. Libertarian socialism, as an example of a broad leftist ideology, is anti-state in its belief, so much so that it advocates the total and immediate dismantling of the centralized state and all illegitimate hierarchies. It goes beyond the relative half measure of limited government peddled by D'Souza fanboys. That is to say, if you believe that government inherently suppresses people's individual liberty via violence or the threat of violence, then many leftists would agree with you. D'Souza and other like-minded rightists do not get to exclusively occupy the anti-big government political position. Even the man they love to hate, Karl Marx, advocated for the eventual withering away of the state. I mean, the government can't be big if it doesn't exist. This idea that statism is inherently left-wing and that the right, or conservatives, or Republicans, or whatever, are pro-small government is actually successful propaganda on their part, and it concedes the premise to people like D'Souza who argue in bad faith. And because of the United States' unique history, it's easy to fall into this trap. But I hate to break it to you, that isn't what the left-right political spectrum is. It's not even close. Authoritarianism is a phenomenon that can admittedly exist on both the left and the right. But fascism is a variant of authoritarianism that exists exclusively on the right. Rightly labeling a country as authoritarian is not enough to also label it left-wing or right-wing. As we did earlier in the video, we must ask ourselves, why is a particular regime authoritarian? But before we answer that question, I want to ask another. Why do contemporary American conservatives support a so-called small government in the first place? Put another way, what do contemporary American conservatives like D'Souza say to things like income inequality or social injustice? Well, these injustices are condoned on the basis that inequality is natural, that a society's betters are justified in their rule over their lessers, and that hierarchy is organic and even necessary. That is the underlying common thread that binds conservatism to fascism, the only difference being the nominal approach to this supposed truth, whether through an authoritarian government or through a so-called small government. In other words, the corollary between the two is its opposition to egalitarianism. Now, that isn't to say that conservatism equates to fascism, but they share, to quote a very smart man, a deep kinship with one another because they are both right-wing in their political orientation, namely in their opposition to equality. Now, just to be clear, I don't think conservatives are fascists. I actually agree with D'Souza. But either is still a phenomenon of the right and, as a consequence, related, no matter how much Dinesh D'Souza wishes they weren't. But hey, don't just take my word for it. I'll leave you with the final quote by Mussolini from The Doctrine of Fascism. Granted that the 18th century was the century of socialism, liberalism, democracy, this does not mean that the 20th century must also be the century of socialism, liberalism, democracy. Political doctrines pass, nations remain. We are free to believe that this is the century of authority, a century tending to the right, a fascist century.